I wasn't expecting much from the office Christmas party. We'd had a rough year and everyone was a bit on edge. But when the invite came through, promising an all-expenses-paid bash with a Santa's Grotto theme, I figured it would be worth a laugh. A few drinks, some bad music, and maybe a half-hearted Secret Santa exchanged. Nothing too special. The venue was an old converted barn out on the edge of town. They'd gone all out with the decorations. Lights hung from the rafters, fake snow was scattered across the floor, and the place had that warm spice scent of mulled wine and pine trees. Everything looked perfect. But something about the setup felt off, like it was trying too hard to be charming, like they were hiding something. The highlight of the evening was the big surprise. A professional Santa had been hired to entertain. He wasn't just a guy in a cheap suit, he was the real deal with a thick white beard, a velvet red suit and an accent I couldn't quite place. He seemed to glide through the crowd, laughing with people and taking photos with the employees' kids. I'll admit, he had the charisma. People were buying into it completely, especially the kids. But as the night wore on, I noticed a few things that didn't sit right with me. At first, it was small stuff, like how the Santa always seemed to be hanging around the same few people. He'd chat with them for ages, then disappear for a while. The other guests didn't seem to notice or care, too busy with their own little bubbles of merriment. Then a couple of people went missing. I don't mean they just wandered off or slipped out for a bit of fresh air. One moment they were there, laughing or talking, and the next they were gone. Nobody seemed to be particularly worried. It wasn't until the third person vanished that I started to feel uneasy. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they'd gone home early or stepped out for a smoke, but when I started looking around the room, it hit me. Something was off. The people who'd gone missing didn't leave behind coats, bags, or phones. I know it sounds crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the Santa had something to do with it. He'd been so present, moving through the crowd like he knew exactly who to focus on. He'd even been near the first person who disappeared, standing just behind them while they were chatting to someone else, and then, poof, they were gone. As the night wore on, I started to get more paranoid. I caught glimpses of Santa moving through the crowd, his eyes scanning faces, his smile a little too wide. He didn't look drunk, didn't look tired, just kind of intent. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was looking for something, or maybe someone. Then, just as I was about to head to the bathroom, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was walking past the staff room and the door was slightly ajar. I swear I saw someone inside, their head poking out from behind a stack of chairs, looking over at me. It was one of the missing people, the one who'd vanished right after Santa had spoken to them earlier in the evening. They were pale, shaking, eyes wide with fear. They opened their mouth to say something but didn't get the chance. A loud, deep laugh echoed from behind them, followed by the sound of boots on the floor. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I ran, and I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air. The fresh, cold air hit me like a slap in the face, and for a moment I thought I was safe. I turned around to see the barn lit up in the distance, the glow of the party still visible through the windows. But as I looked back toward the entrance, I saw him, Santa, standing in the doorway, staring right at me. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his frame, tall, wide-shouldered, too still for someone just standing around. And then he moved, slow, deliberate steps towards me. The smile on his face stretched impossibly wide, like it was glued there. I turned and bolted down the driveway, not stopping, not looking back. I don't know how long I ran, I don't know how I managed to get home, but when I did, I checked my phone. There were missed calls and texts from people at the party, but there were no answers from the people who'd gone missing. Just like that, they were gone. I couldn't sleep that night. And the next day, the police were at the office asking questions. Apparently, they found the place empty when they arrived. No sign of anyone. And I don't know what happened to the others. I don't know where they went. All I know is that when I think back to the party, I remember that wide, sickening smile on Santa's face. And I remember that it never quite left. It was supposed to be a pretty standard gig. Just another delivery, dressed up as Santa for some fancy promotion or another. A few presents to drop off at an address out in the middle of nowhere, an old mansion, or at least it looked like it. Big place. All dark windows and snow-covered grounds set way back from the road. I'd never been out that way before. and I wasn't sure how I'd even find it if it weren't for the GPS on my phone. When I pulled up, I wasn't sure what to think. The driveway was long and winding, with tall hedges lining either side. No cars outside, just this big old house looming over me like it had been forgotten about for years. I stepped up onto the porch, feeling like I'd wandered into a different world. Everything seemed too quiet, too still. I knocked on the door and it took a minute, but someone finally answered. An older couple, both dressed in black, with fancy clothes that didn't quite seem to fit the weather outside. They smiled at me, wide and almost eager, like they'd been expecting me. Said something about the promotion, the delivery, but I didn't catch most of it. Their voices were too soft, like they were afraid of waking someone up. They ushered me inside, and the first thing I noticed was the fire in the hearth. It roared, warm and inviting, but the flames flickered in a way that didn't seem quite natural. Shadows danced on the walls, moving even when the room stayed still. I tried to ignore it, to play along with their little act, but it didn't feel right. They led me into a grand living room, all decorated for Christmas. A tree off in the corner full of lights and ornaments, and the table nearby stacked high with glasses and a bottle of something dark that I didn't recognize. I thought maybe they'd offer me a drink, but they didn't. Instead, they asked me to sit down and made some small talk, though I couldn't tell if they were asking me questions or just rambling about the holidays. It was hard to pay attention because their eyes kept flicking away, like they were watching something outside that wasn't there. Then I started to notice the details, little things that didn't quite add up. The way the walls seemed to close in around me, or the way the air felt colder than it should have been, even though I was sitting right next to the fire. The way the couple kept trying to pour me a drink but never quite getting it right. The liquid spilling over the sides, the glasses wobbling in their hands. I thought maybe they were drunk, but their hands didn't shake like someone who'd had too much. They were steady, almost robotic, like they were doing everything by some unseen command. They started talking more urgently then, saying things about the night, about the city, about secrets. I didn't understand most of what they said. It was like they were telling me stories that didn't make sense, jumping from one subject to another without pause. I nodded along at first, tried to keep up, but it wasn't long before I started to feel like I'd wandered into a dream or a nightmare. And then the door slammed shut behind me, hard enough to make me jump. I turned around, trying to see if someone else had come in, but there was no one there. The couple didn't seem to notice. They just kept talking as if nothing had happened. I tried to get up, to make my way to the front door, but I couldn't move. My legs felt heavy, like they were filled with lead, and my hands wouldn't listen to my brain. I was stuck, sitting there watching the fire burn, feeling like I was trapped in place. The room seemed to shift, and I started to notice shapes forming in the shadows, faces, half-glimpsed figures that moved as the light flickered. They were watching me, too, and I couldn't tell if they were real or just more tricks of the eye. The couple kept smiling, but their eyes didn't match their faces. They were wide, frantic almost, like they were trying to tell me something without saying it out loud. I felt like I was surrounded, like every surface of the room was closing in, getting closer and closer. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I felt frozen, trapped in my own skin. Then the front door creaked open. I couldn't see anything past it, just darkness beyond. I tried to yell, to scream for help, but my voice wouldn't work. I was stuck, trapped and silent, and then I saw it. A figure stepped through the doorway, tall and shadowy, with red eyes that glowed in the dark. It was almost like it knew me, like it had been waiting for me all along. I couldn't look away, couldn't move, even though every part of me was screaming to run. The figure took a step forward, closer and closer, until I couldn't see anything else. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't think, couldn't feel. Everything was wrong, and I couldn't find a way out. I just sat there, frozen, watching as the figure came closer and closer until it was right in front of me, towering over me, staring down. And then everything went black. I woke up back in my truck, parked on the side of the road. The mansion was gone, no sign that it had ever existed. I tried to tell myself it was all a dream, but something about it felt too real. The fire, the shadows, the figure, it was all too vivid to just be a hallucination. I don't know what happened, and I don't think I want to find out. It started just before Christmas. The first letter appeared on Mrs. Harper's doorstep, the old woman who lives 2 doors down from me. I didn't know what it was at first, just a plain white envelope, no return address, just her name written in neat handwriting on the front. At first we thought it was a mistake. Maybe it had been sent to the wrong address, but then another one turned up, this time for Mr. Cooper, the mechanic who owns the garage down the street. And then more started appearing. They were all addressed to people in our small town, the ones who'd been around long enough for everyone to know their names. Everyone was talking about it. Some said it was a joke, probably a prank from the teenagers up at the school, and others shrugged it off as nonsense. It was all a bit weird, sure, but nothing to be too worried about. At least that's what we told ourselves. The letters were always the same. Inside there was a short, handwritten note, no signature, nothing to identify who had written them, but the message was clear. It was a list of things the person had done. The note would say things like, "You've been dishonest," or "You've hurt someone," or "You've stolen from others." All the little things that no one would necessarily notice, the sort of stuff that maybe no one else knew about, but the writer seemed to know everything. Things that weren't common knowledge, not unless you'd been watching. At first, everyone just laughed it off. I did too, I won't lie. It seemed like one of those dumb holiday pranks that some bored soul did every year. But then it started getting weirder. The first disappearance was Mr. Cooper, the mechanic. One day he wasn't at his garage, just gone. People figured maybe he had gone on holiday or something, but his shop had been locked up tight for days. No one thought much of it until his car turned up on a deserted road outside town, his phone still inside. Then Mrs. Harper, the next person to get one of those letters, didn't show up to church that Sunday. That wasn't like her. She was always there, rain or shine. When people went to her house to check on her, they found it empty. No sign of struggle, nothing out of place. Just her house, abandoned. It was after that when people started getting nervous. I don't know why, but something about it felt different. At first we told ourselves it was just a coincidence. It had to be. People disappear, it happens all the time. But after a while, no one was so sure. More letters kept arriving and more people started to go missing. Always those who'd received one. No one could figure out why or how, but it started to feel like the letter was some kind of death sentence. Then one day I found one of those letters on my own doorstep. I was already nervous, but seeing my name on the front made me feel sick. I didn't open it straight away. I just stood there, staring at it for what felt like forever, not knowing if I should tear it up and forget it or open it and see what it said. In the end, I opened it. The letter was the same as the others, just a list of things I'd done. I'd always been the quiet type, never much of a troublemaker, but reading it I felt exposed. It listed little things I'd thought I'd gotten away with, an argument I'd had with my neighbor years ago, things I'd said in passing that I regretted, all these tiny moments that no one would have remembered. If not for someone paying close attention, it was like they knew everything, and that's when I realized how much trouble we were all in. It wasn't just a prank, it was real. The next day, the police came by my house. They'd found something strange in the woods just outside town, a small cabin hidden away from sight. It was abandoned, but there were signs that someone had been living there recently. They found a stack of letters identical to the ones that had been appearing in the mailboxes of everyone in town. And when they looked closer, they found something else. It was a collection of old photographs, people from our town, from years back, some of them. People I didn't even recognize. I don't know what happened to the police after that. The last I saw of them was when they drove out to the woods. They never came back. None of them. Now it's just me. No one's seen anyone for days. The letters stopped arriving after that, but I can't help thinking that whoever's behind it all, they're still out there, watching. I thought about leaving, running away, but I can't shake the feeling that it's too late for that now. Every morning I wake up, check the door, check the windows. I don't know what I'm expecting, but I keep waiting for something. Waiting for the next letter, the next person to vanish. It started off like any other Christmas season, really. The shop was busy, of course, more than usual given the time of year, but nothing I couldn't handle. I own a small toy store on the corner of High Street, and the holidays always bring in a crowd, but also more work. I'd been running the place for over 10 years, and I'd seen the usual holiday rush. So when the idea of hiring a Santa Claus for a bit of extra flair came up, I didn't think twice. I found the man through an agency, someone who came highly recommended. They said he was professional, a real showman, the sort of Santa who'd make the kids beam and give them that extra special magic that only a man in a red suit could. At first, things seemed perfect. He was punctual, always in full costume, and the kids loved him. He sat with them on his knee, posed for pictures, and did his little ho, ho, ho routine with genuine gusto. The sales took off too, parents snapping up toys left and right after their kids sat on his lap, which was exactly what I needed. But it didn't take long for things to feel off. For one, he never left. He'd linger around, chatting with customers, sometimes for too long. He tried to give unsolicited advice about the toys, speaking to them as if he knew more about them than anyone else. A bit strange for a man who had only been around for a week. I caught him a few times just staring at the employees when he thought no one was looking, his smile a little too wide. It made my staff uncomfortable, and I could see why. But the real trouble began when some of the complaints started coming in. One of the women on the floor mentioned how he had stayed a little too long after closing hours. Another one said he'd followed her to the back room, though she swore he hadn't said a word. They were whispering behind his back, asking me to do something about it, but when I spoke with him, he was always so charming, so convincing, too convincing. He'd laugh it off, say it was all part of the act, that he just wanted to make the holidays special for everyone. And the sales, they skyrocketed. People were spending like they hadn't in years, walking out with bags full of toys. It seemed almost too good to be true, but how could I argue with the results? Things took a turn when the staff members who complained started disappearing. First, it was Ellie, one of the cashiers. She'd been working late one night and never came back. The police didn't find anything, no trace, not even a single lead. Then came Craig, the guy who managed the floor. Same story, gone. No sign of struggle, nothing, just gone. I didn't tell anyone at the store, but I knew. It was the third disappearance that made me act. Jane, one of the floor assistants, came to me one morning, all shaky and pale. She said she'd heard something in the back rooms during the night, strange sounds, like something heavy dragging along the floor. I told her it was probably nothing, just the building settling, but deep down, I knew she'd heard something. I could feel it. And then she didn't show up for work the next day. That's when I started to put the pieces together. I watched the Santa man closer. He was always there, lurking, his big belly hanging over his belt, his eyes scanning the room in a way that made me shiver. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching everyone, waiting for something or someone. When the next shift change came, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I'd catch him red-handed, maybe confront him. I stayed late, hiding behind the counter, waiting for him to finish with his last customer of the night. The moment he turned off the lights and locked the door, I knew something was wrong. There was no one left. I hadn't seen anyone leave. He was alone. I crept through the aisles, trying to keep quiet. I felt like I was walking through a dream, my heart thudding in my chest, the cold chill of the store making my breath fog up in the dark. And then I saw it. At the back of the store, in the corner, there was something strange, something large covered by a tarpaulin. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I moved towards it slowly, every step heavier than the last. I peeled the cover back, and I wish I hadn't. There on the cold concrete floor was something, or rather someone. It was hard to tell at first, but as I moved closer, I realized it was a body. A body wrapped in red cloth, its face distorted and blue. I stumbled backwards, my stomach churning. Then I heard the footsteps. I looked up. Santa stood in front of me, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. He stepped forward, and then everything went black. I woke up to a sound I couldn't place, the kind of noise that tugs at the back of your mind, like a memory just out of reach. It was coming from downstairs. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding, adrenaline spiking. I looked at the clock. It was barely 6 a.m. The kids were still asleep. I rubbed my face, trying to shake the sleep away, but something didn't feel right. The house was too quiet. I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floorboards, and crept down the stairs. The living room was dark, save for the faint glow of the Christmas tree lights casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The air was heavy, like something had settled in. The smell of pine was mixed with something else, something I couldn't place. I froze at the bottom of the stairs. There, sitting on the couch, was a man dressed as Santa Claus. His suit was pristine, too perfect, bright red with white fur trim. He was sitting with his legs crossed, hands folded in his lap, staring at the Christmas tree. His face was hidden by the bushy white beard, but there was something about the way he sat. It wasn't like someone enjoying a peaceful moment. It felt predatory. For a moment I stood there, unable to move, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint what. My mind scrambled for explanations, trying to cling to anything logical. Maybe one of the kids had invited a friend over. Maybe it was some twisted joke. But no, that didn't fit. The man was too still, too deliberate. I couldn't breathe. I glanced to the left, where the kitchen was, where the front door was still locked, the way I left it last night, the way it should be. Then I heard a creak, soft, almost imperceptible, like a door opening. I didn't move. The Santa man finally shifted, breaking the silence. Slowly he raised his head and I saw his eyes. Black, empty pits, hollow like a void, and yet somehow they were focused on me, staring deep into me. It was like he could see through everything, see through the walls of my mind. I should have screamed, but nothing came out. I was frozen in place, my legs like stone, my mind racing but incapable of forming a coherent thought. His lips parted slowly and he spoke, but the words didn't sound right. They were too smooth, too rehearsed, like someone reading a script from a page they had memorized. "I've delivered their gifts." His voice was soft, but it had an unnatural weight to it, like it came from somewhere dark and far too close. The hairs on my neck stood up. I looked around again and I could see the stockings hanging above the fireplace, the presents neatly stacked beneath the tree. But it wasn't right, not the way I had left them. There was something off. I took a step forward, my feet sliding across the floor, the sound of my own movement painfully loud in the otherwise silent room. The man didn't move, didn't even flinch. He just sat there, staring. The sound of my children's breathing, steady and peaceful, floated down the hallway from upstairs, and for a moment I thought I could just run. I could go back, get them, lock the door, call the police. But something told me not to. That would be the wrong thing to do. Something was pulling me closer. I took another step, then another. That's when I saw the edges of the room start to blur. The shadows of the Christmas tree seemed to grow longer, stretch farther out of place. And the man, Santa, seemed to swell, like his presence was stretching across the room, infecting it. His smile cracked open under the bushy white beard, too wide, too stretched. I saw it then. Behind the suit, the pristine red, there was something underneath, something moving. I couldn't understand what it was, but it looked like skin, but wrong. Stretching, pulling, like he wasn't wearing the suit was wearing him. That's when the kids stirred upstairs and the normal sound of the house returned. The light from the hallway flickered on, and I could hear the creak of their beds as they shifted. The man shifted too, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, as if he had been planning it all along. He leaned forward, the creak of his joints scraping like broken bones, and the soft exhale he let out made my stomach turn. As I stepped forward closer towards the man on the couch, a sudden flash of realization struck me, cold as ice. The door had been locked, and yet the footprints in the snow outside were fresh. The snow, untouched, had no marks. The sleigh bells I heard last night, they weren't from the streets. They were from inside the house. The children started to call my name from upstairs, and the man turned his head sharply, as if he knew exactly who I was. His hollow eyes seemed to glimmer, dark and full of something more than malice. And then, without a sound, he stood. His legs bent wrong as he moved, the seams of his suit ripping. He didn't look back as he walked towards the stairs, towards my children. I watched him go, unable to stop him, unable to scream. The world around me had stopped, frozen in place as he took the first step up. The door behind me was still locked, the windows sealed tight, and yet the sound of sleigh bells echoed in the room, a cold, cruel promise hanging in the air. Then a soft voice reached me from upstairs. "Santa's here, Daddy. He's ready for dinner." And the man's voice from the stairs was closer now, much closer. We had a plan. It was a simple one. Dress up as Santa, sneak into the rich neighborhoods, slide down chimneys and grab whatever we could. Simple. And for the most part it worked. Christmas Eve, we had a dozen houses lined up. The people who lived in them weren't there. Off on holiday or away visiting relatives. They'd be gone for days. Perfect. It was cold, the kind of chill that cuts right to your bones. The streets were quieter than usual. The white Christmas almost eerie in its stillness. A perfect night for a job. I was the second to go in. I climbed the ladder to the roof, slid down the chimney, and dropped into the living room with barely a sound. It smelled faintly of cinnamon and pine, the typical Christmas stuff. The others followed. In, out. No one would ever know, but then it all went wrong. It was Dave who went last. Dave, The one who had insisted on the whole Santa idea. I didn't mind the idea of robbing houses. Hell, I've done worse, but Dave insisted on the Santa thing. He said it'd be funny that no one would suspect Santa, and it worked at first, until Dave got stuck. We had already gotten everything we could. I was heading back to the van when I heard the shouting. It was muffled, like someone was struggling, but Dave's voice was unmistakable. He was stuck halfway down the chimney, wedged tight. His feet were dangling in the air, and his arms flailed uselessly. I wasn't too bothered at first. It was a stupid accident. Dave wasn't the brightest, and he'd always been a bit too proud of his Santa expertise. But when I looked up at the others, they didn't seem too concerned. They were already starting to move towards the van, their hands full of jewelry, cash, whatever they could grab. They were leaving him behind. I hesitated. I knew the rules. If one of us got caught, the others didn't wait. But it felt wrong, you know? I looked back at the house. The windows were dark, but there was a faint glow from the fireplace. I could still hear Dave's muffled grumbling, but it sounded different now, more panicked. I stood there for a moment thinking about it. Then I heard something else. A small sound, something quiet but deliberate. It came from inside the house. It was a sound I can't really describe, like something was crawling behind the walls. I froze. The air had gotten colder somehow, and the house seemed darker than before. It was almost like the whole place was alive, like it was watching us. I started to move, but my feet felt heavy. Something was wrong. It wasn't just Dave. I could feel it in my bones. The house didn't feel right. The others had already disappeared down the street, their footsteps crunching in the snow, and I was standing alone staring at the chimney that had swallowed Dave whole. And then, from inside the house, I heard the floorboards creak. Not in the way you'd expect from a house settling. No, this was deliberate, slow, steady, like someone was walking towards the chimney. My heart started racing. I was just about to turn and run when I heard Dave again. This time his voice was quieter, like he was whispering something. And then the sound came, faint but unmistakable. A scraping, like something sharp dragging across metal. I didn't know what it was, but it made my skin crawl. I knew then. I knew we had made a mistake. This wasn't just some rich family's house. This wasn't a place where we could just take what we wanted and leave. No, this was something else. Before I could think, there was a sharp tug on the chimney flue. I saw Dave's legs kicking as he struggled, and then nothing, no more noise. It was like he'd disappeared, pulled into the house, as if the chimney had swallowed him whole. I backed away, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I didn't even notice the cold anymore. The streetlights flickered, and I was sure I saw a figure moving behind the curtains. Someone or something. A shadow, tall and unnaturally still. I turned and ran. I didn't look back, but even as I sprinted towards the van, I could hear the scratching sound again, closer now, almost as if it was coming from beneath the earth. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I reached the van. My hands were shaking. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. I didn't care about the others. I didn't care about the loot. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was dark again, but in the window there was something, a figure standing perfectly still. It wasn't Dave, and it wasn't Santa. It had no face, just an empty, black void where a face should have been. It started like any other Christmas shopping trip, the kind where you're rushing around trying to get everything done before the holidays really hit. I was with my mates, just walking around the mall, laughing and messing about, not really thinking about anything serious. We were just trying to kill time, like usual. We spotted him before he saw us, the mall Santa, sitting in his chair by the Christmas tree with a big red sack of presents at his side. Now, I know it's a bit childish, but we'd been talking all day about pranking him. It was the perfect setup. A bunch of teens, bored out of their minds with too much time on their hands. We figured we'd swap his sack of presents with one full of garbage. Just a harmless laugh, right? Nothing too crazy. He'd never know the difference. He was old and a bit dozy looking, sitting there with that fake beard. We thought it'd be funny, maybe get a few laughs out of it. So, while he wasn't paying attention, we did it. We swapped the sacks, his big festive one for the one we'd filled with leftover wrappers, old food, and some dirty napkins we found in the food court. We had a good laugh as we walked away, seeing him still sitting there, completely oblivious. But the laughter didn't last long. It was about 10 minutes later when I noticed him. He was standing by the entrance, watching us. He was still dressed as Santa, but there was something different about him. The way he was standing, too still, too focused. I nudged my mate, and we both looked over at him. I thought maybe he was just another mole Santa doing his rounds, but no. He was staring right at us, like he knew exactly who we were. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. The mall started to feel strange after that. Not right. The bright Christmas lights seemed to flicker a bit, like they were malfunctioning. People were still shopping, but it felt like they were all too quiet. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We tried to forget about it, but I couldn't stop glancing back at him. Santa. He wasn't sitting anymore. He was walking, his big red boots thudding against the tile floor, slow but deliberate. I felt like he was following us. My mates didn't notice, or maybe they didn't care, but I did. He was moving closer, getting nearer, always keeping his distance but never losing sight of us. That's when the fear started creeping in. We were in a shop looking at the toys when I turned around and there he was, right by the entrance. Santa. His face wasn't smiling anymore. It wasn't a jolly old man in a suit anymore. His eyes were hard, cold, and his mouth was set in a tight line. He was looking right at me, his head slightly tilted like he was sizing me up. It felt like he was waiting for something. I thought about saying something to the security guard, but the mall seemed emptier than before. Like the crowd had thinned out without me noticing. I felt like I was suffocating. My heart started to race. I told my mates we needed to go. We left the shop. But as we walked through the corridor, there he was again, standing at the end, watching us, and this time he was holding the sack. The same sack. The one we'd swapped, the one with all the garbage inside. He wasn't far away now, just a few meters down the hall. I couldn't see his mouth, but I could tell he was angry. He took a step forward, slow, like he was stalking something. His eyes never left us. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, cornered, like there was no way out. I tried to get my mates to move faster, but they didn't get it. They were laughing still, thinking it was just a joke. But the joke had stopped being funny a long time ago. There was something wrong with him. I could feel it now. My skin was crawling. Then we heard him. His voice, quiet, but it carried. He said, the way he said it, it wasn't just words. It was like a command, something deep in my bones. It made my blood run cold. I turned to run, but I couldn't. My feet were glued to the ground. My mates were already ahead, but I couldn't move. He took another step and another, slowly but surely closing the gap. I didn't look back. I couldn't. We bolted down the corridor, but when I turned the corner, I looked back once, just once, and there he was, standing still again, holding that sack, watching us. I don't know what happened next. My mates and I ran through the mall, out the doors, into the cold air. We didn't stop until we were a good distance away, but even then I felt like he was still watching us. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he did it, but I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there somewhere waiting, or waiting for us to return what we took. The first time I saw him, I thought it was just some weird quirk of the season. The town had always been a little strange at Christmas. Drunken carolers, decorations that looked as if they hadn't been changed in years, and the odd few who insisted on wearing their Christmas jumpers all through winter. But this man, he stood out even in the oddness of the season. He appeared one cold December evening walking down Main Street in a Santa suit that didn't look quite right. It wasn't the standard red and white, jolly type of Santa we were used to. His suit was worn, a bit ragged at the edges, and the beard was uneven, greyish, unkempt, like it had been pulled from the floor of some old attic. He wasn't smiling either. Instead, he had this stoic look on his face, eyes hidden behind dark glasses. The kind you'd expect someone to wear when they didn't want to be recognized. At first, no one really thought much of him. He just kept walking through the town like some odd ritual he had no intention of stopping. The following night, he was back. And the next. It was almost like clockwork, this man patrolling the streets, always appearing after dusk. It was clear he wasn't a regular figure. No one had ever seen him before, and no one had heard of him volunteering for the community events. But he quickly made his presence known. He'd stop children on the sidewalk, put his hand on their shoulder, look them up and down, nod in approval. He'd smile, but it wasn't the warm, jolly smile you'd expect from someone dressed as Santa. It was unsettling, like he was looking for something. The townsfolk were divided at first. Some thought it was nice that someone cared enough to watch over the children. Others found it strange. But since he wasn't doing anything overtly wrong, they decided to leave him be. It wasn't until the first child disappeared that the mood shifted. Amy Harper. She was 8. Her parents reported her missing just after she'd gone out to play in the snow. She had been playing near the park, but when they went to check on her, she was gone. The whole town turned upside down looking for her, but there was no sign, no trace, nothing, not even her footprints in the snow. It felt like she had just vanished. The next few days were a blur of worry. Flyers were put up and people gathered in the town hall to discuss what to do. And then it happened again. Another child, this time little Jamie Miller, only 6, had been playing with his sister at their grandmother's house. He'd wandered off into the yard, and no one saw him again. It didn't take long before the community began whispering. Everyone's eyes turned to the man in the Santa suit, the man who had been keeping kids safe. People started piecing things together, drawing connections between his nightly patrols and the disappearances. There were rumors of him being seen near the homes of the missing children, even on the nights they vanished. I decided to follow him one evening. I waited until after the pub had emptied and the streets had quietened. The snow crunched under my boots as I trailed behind him, careful to stay out of sight. He walked at a deliberate pace, turning down streets, glancing into windows. He didn't approach any of the homes directly, but he lingered, watching. The whole time, the air felt heavy, like something was pressing in from all sides, as if the town itself knew something I didn't. After a while, he stopped at a small house at the edge of the town, the kind that looked like it should be deserted. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door, the snow gathering at his feet. I crouched behind a hedge, heart pounding as the minutes dragged by. Then he did something strange. He stepped up to the door, knocked softly, and waited. No one answered, but then the door creaked open just a fraction. A tiny, pale hand reached out from inside, grabbing the Santa's arm. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I turned and ran, my heart in my throat. I didn't stop until I was back at my house, panting for breath. I knew I had to do something, tell someone. But I wasn't sure who would believe me. No one would believe that the man they thought was keeping kids safe was actually the one taking them. The next morning, when I went into town, there was no sign of him. No Santa patrolling the streets. No one had seen him since that night, and the strange thing was, the missing children. No one was talking about them anymore. It was like they'd never existed. It wasn't until I passed by the park that I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the snow near the swings was a single footprint, deep, heavy, as if something much larger had been there, and embedded in the snow just beside it a small, faded red mitten.